What are the health challenges of being a college student? Welcome, Gyno-Curious listeners. I am Dr. Amy Novat. We are here to investigate what it means to be a healer and to be healed. Today, I have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Yakira Teitel, the Director of Health Services at Bard College in Annondale-on-Hudson, New York. Dr. Teitel, whose name I hope I'm pronouncing correctly, received her MD from the University of California, San Francisco, and her master's in public health from Columbia University. She is a trained family and community medicine clinician. Welcome, Yakira.
Thank you so much.
It's so nice to have you here.
It's wonderful to be here.
So let's start with, how did you end up at Bard, having done most of your work in more urban settings?
It's a great question. Really, it was kind of a trifecta of the wildfires in California a few years ago, the intensity of the pandemic, and having had a baby 6 months before we all went into lockdown. So those factors led me to a bit of an existential crisis. And we moved out here to the Red Hook, Tivoli area because my husband's father and stepmother live out here. So it was really, we just came for a few months to escape what unfortunately in California is now known as fire season. And we ended up staying. We just loved it. And then I found my way to Bard because I've always been particularly interested in teenagers and young adults. That's always been the group of people I connect most with and I love working with. And having an opportunity to do that here locally was just too good to turn down.
Wonderful. Well, I'm sorry about the two components in your trifecta, but congratulations on your baby.
Oh, thank you. She's
Yeah.
about to be 4.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. She'll always be your baby.
She will.
So I guess I'd like to ask, what is it about the population of college students that is so intriguing to you? And I must admit, to me too.
Mm-hmm.
What is it about their nature?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think about it often. I think that it is a time in life when you're really figuring out who you are. That kind of first layer of figuring out who you are. I mean, now 20 years after I graduated college, I realize that's a never-ending process. But I feel like they're so open and interested and engaged with the world. And I find that young people often have a critical analysis of the world going on around them that leads to totally new ways of thinking about the world. I feel like the more time I spend with young people in that early adulthood, the more I get the opportunity to think about the world in ways I wouldn't necessarily otherwise.
They're provocative.
Yeah.
Even without knowing they're provocative, they inspire me, just like you, to ask questions of myself on a personal level and certainly on a professional level.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And they tend to be willing to explore change.
Absolutely. That is another big part of it, is that it feels very different than working with people who are decades deep into whatever choices they've made in their lives, circumstances in their lives. There is a sense of opportunity and hope for change in a different way, for sure.
Yeah. I often think about how when I see them in the office, I'm almost literally watching growth occur.
Yeah.
Whether it's, bear with me, on a kind of a cellular level to the more existential who am I level.
Absolutely. And I do a fair amount of gender-affirming care. And that, to me, has just opened up a world of being able to accompany people really on a journey of growth into becoming who they really are. That is honestly one of the most incredible things I've gotten to witness as a clinician.
So I was going to talk to you about that, but let's just go right in. But before we talk about that work, I just want to remind the audience that we're talking about a large number of folks in terms of college. In the year 2021-22 academic year, there were around 20.2 million college or university undergraduate students in the United States. Many college or university students are living on their own for the first time in their lives. And although they tend to be young and healthy, they are also exposed to many new health risks and health questions. So let's go back to something you just mentioned in terms of gender and sexuality. For our audience, what do you mean by that first and foremost?
What I mean by gender-affirming care is essentially, primarily what I do is providing hormone treatment, broadly speaking, or medications that block hormones in the body to assist people in having their physical bodies express the gender that they are inside. And so what that looks like is primarily, prescribing hormones and or hormone blockers, and sometimes additional medications to help people go through those changes and then tracking them as they go.
As the clinician at Bard, just a logistical question. Are these folks able to make these decisions on their own? Are they emancipated in that respect, or is there a need for consents from parents, etc.?
So the vast majority of students at Bard are over 18, and in the U.S., that means they're making their own medical decisions. That being said, we do have some 17-year-olds, and so in those cases, absolutely, we have to get consent from families. And I will say, unfortunately, that I have seen families that are unsupportive of their child's gender and gender journey find ways to interfere, unfortunately. And one of the main ways to do that is through limiting their child's access to insurance that would allow them to access gender care. And so one of the really kind of amazing pieces of college health is that we don't bill insurance for our visits. And so I'm able to treat people, even who are in situations like that, at a very low cost, because really all we're talking about is them then having to access medication. But so, yes, they are absolutely making their own decisions. We have informed consent conversations that are very extensive about the risks and benefits. And to be honest, so many of the students that I work with have already done so much research by the time they get to me that oftentimes it's more eliciting what they already know, helping them think through the choices that they're making, and then starting treatment. But yeah, it is a big transition to be making their own decisions about their bodies. But it's really nice to work with people who are in that position for the first time.
I'm so grateful you're doing this work. We're living in a country right now that is questioning so many aspects of choice. Choice around our body, choice about our gender, choice about abortion, etc. So it's wonderful to know that Bard has created an environment in which folks can make these decisions. What I want to point out to our audience, or have you explain to our audience, is so much of the criticism, around transitioning with gender is that folks just assume it's easy, that a doctor is just giving the hormones nonchalantly, and that it's just because someone said, I want to be a boy or I want to be a girl. Can you share with our audience how untrue that is?
Yes. And I would like to point out, I find it honestly hypocritical of the medical establishment, because we give people hormones all the time for a variety of conditions that align with our more societally accepted ideas of who someone should be or what their gender is. I do have very in-depth conversations with every patient that I start on hormone therapy about the risks and benefits. And I have those conversations with folks who I'm starting on hormonal birth control, because that is a very common use of hormones. And obviously the dosing is different and we don't have to get into all the technicalities, but I think it's important. One thing I try to hold myself to is thinking about would I do this differently just because this student is trans? Or would I do this differently just because? And really, I try to bring to my practice a sense that what we're doing to someone's body when we're introducing a medication or a treatment is making these changes, like you said, on a cellular level. And so no matter who someone is or the reason why we're doing them, there are things that we should let patients know about what they should expect, and some of the unexpected consequences of those as well. So yes, it is not something that someone just comes in and gets dispensed easily, but at the same time, I try really hard not to be a gatekeeper. Because I think oftentimes we make people who've already had to go through an incredibly difficult process and are still in it of coming to understand that they are not, existing within the already predetermined place within this gender binary that I hope your audience has already come to understand is not a binary, but a spectrum, like pretty much everything. And so I try to not make their lives more difficult. I try to give them information and let them know that they have control over the process and that I'll be accompanying them. But I try really hard to check myself around the gatekeeping, because I do think that the medical community, it's a profession that is historically and still currently, I think, very patriarchal. And so there's a lot of thinking that we know better than patients. And yeah, I'm always trying to unlearn that for myself.
Thank you for that journey. And patriarchy is a word I use or say a great deal on Gyno Curious, because it is so true in every aspect of medicine and healing that centuries of patriarchy has existed, and it's alive and well, and particularly misogyny. And the dislike of women is essentially extended into dislike of anyone who's not willing to be on that binary mapping. So I'm so glad, again, that students have this opportunity to speak to you about medications, their risks and their benefits, and their opportunities.
Yeah.
I know that on some college campuses, if someone is taking hormones for transitioning, they're also seeing someone at the psychology group. Pardon me, I'm blanking on what you'd call it on the college campus. But does that happen at Bard as well, or is that not a necessary component?
So at Bard, just to back up a little bit, at many college campuses, health services encompasses both physical and mental health. At Bard, the way it works is that there's health services, which I'm the director of, and then there's counseling services. And we work very closely together. I have a really wonderful working relationship with the director of counseling services, but we are very intentionally separate departments. I think most people should be in therapy, and certainly college students. I really wish I had been in therapy as a college student, but in that time and my life and society at large, it was, I think, for me anyway, felt much less of an accepted piece of my experience. And generally speaking, all of the students that I'm working with around gender-affirming care are in therapy, whether it's at Bard or outside of Bard. And that's, usually they come to me already being in counseling because it's part of the support network that they need to exist in a world that's trying to tell them that they shouldn't be who they are. And then there are, especially on state and federal levels, there's requirements that, and I don't want to get too much into it, but I really don't see, I really disagree with the idea of someone's gender identity fitting outside of our prescribed binary as a disorder. But there is a lot of gatekeeping within medicine and within particularly accessing surgical interventions that is based on that. So, sometimes there are times when whether or not someone wants to be in counseling, they have to engage with that system in order to get the affirming care that they're looking for.
We have so micromanaged, in, I think, a very disrespectful way, the way folks pursue wellness.
Yeah, I agree.
And there's just so much judgment around it. I want to ask you, you mentioned how you think it's important that the health services is separated from the counseling. Thank you. That word is eluding me this morning. Can you speak to me why you feel that's important?
Yeah, I think it's really important because it's important that students really feel that their confidentiality is real, that they can talk to a counselor, and the counselors at Bard have different backgrounds. Some are therapists, psychologists, social workers, but that they can speak to that person in confidence, and that unless they're signing a release, that's not going to impact or inform their relationship with me or one of the other medical providers. And that's really important to me because, I certainly get into therapeutic conversations with the students that I see, and we talk about their mental health struggles for sure, but I don't ever want to feel like students have to be telling me that or that's being disclosed without their consent.
I think there is a certain level of security. Certainly there's security in knowing that one's information is private and secure. Absolutely. I also think particularly at that age where young people are trying to understand the weaving of the mind and the body and how related they are and yet separate, just understanding and having an opportunity to segregate them if they want to, or enmesh them if they want to. And it sounds like you provide an environment in the health services that certainly doesn't ignore mental health. I would imagine one can't avoid that, particularly in this age group. We know that mental health is one of the most significant problems on college campuses. And I guess I'd ask, is that true because, in fact, these kids are struggling more emotionally, or is that we're finally in a place where we're honoring people's emotional and psychological well-being?
I think it's such an important question, and my guess is that it's a combination of both. I definitely feel like, as we were talking about earlier, how young people are thinking about the world in ways beyond what I would have been thinking about at their age. I do feel like this generation in general, and I don't love making generational generalizations, but I do feel like they are more in touch with their emotional landscapes than I certainly was as a college student. And I think some of that is societal, that there is more recognition of that mental health and physical health are interconnected inherently. And I think it's something that their generation is exploring in new ways. I also think in some certain areas, therapy and access to therapy has become more common. However, I think across the board, there's still not enough access to therapy, and certainly not to psychiatry. And even at Bard, where we have a very robust counseling program, I think we could always use more. And I do think it is both. I also think absolutely we can't underestimate what this generation of young people has gone through. The students who are starting right now were in high school at the beginning of the pandemic lockdown. And there's no question that was a collective traumatic event. And people have lost family members. People have spent years in their rooms alone, stuck with their families at times when previous generations of teenagers would have been really more out with their friends. There's absolutely some truth that some of it is that there's more psychological distress, but also I think there's a piece of it that's just that they are also understanding what their needs are and asking for us to meet them.
The young women, cis, trans, binary, transitioning, who I see in my office are so willing to say out loud, I have a mental health problem.
Yeah.
This is new. This is
absolutely.
New. It's great because there's no shame around it anymore. There is an acceptance that this is a part of their everyday pursuit to be well in general. I admire them for their courage because, again, there's been so much stigma associated with mental illness, certainly in the past. And like you, when I was in college years ago, you just didn't talk about it. You didn't talk about it.
Yeah. And I do think also, this is just a personal belief, I think that it's hard to exist in this world without, and not to minimize anxiety and depression and at all, but I also think that sometimes it's a healthy response to an unhealthy world.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Radical action comes out of radical realities and responses. And whether we're just talking about our nervous system's flight and fight, or our intellectual capacity to look around and see all that is breaking down in our society, it demands a certain amount of radical, hard behavioral responses. This has to trigger these emotional contours, right? I mean, if you're being honest, and it's heavy stuff. It's really heavy stuff.
Yeah, it is. And I think young people are thinking about the world in those terms.
Absolutely. Yeah. And whether that's the internet, the globalization of the world has certainly demanded in a way that they see beyond their four walls.
Yeah.
I also want to point out, you mentioned something briefly, but I want to point out to our audience that we're talking about a college campus, which is a very particular microcosm, and that there is a very real lack of resources and equity and access in the greater world that I want to make sure we honor.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think even Bard is a really interesting place. The student body comes from really all over. I don't know if you know this or if any of your listeners do, but Bard has been one of the colleges that has done a lot of welcoming in refugees and displaced students first from Afghanistan and now from Ukraine and Russia. And then there's a significant population who are coming from mainland China, and folks really come from all over the world. And so I think when we talk about these things like the stigma around mental health changing, that is hopefully we're getting there in the United States. But we also have so many students who come from radically different contexts in which it really isn't okay to talk about mental health, or it really isn't okay to question your gender identity. And so I also think that part of what's really exciting to witness at Bard is folks coming from all these different places around the world and exchanging those ideas. Because also, it's not just to say that that the students from the U.S. have so much to give, but also so much to learn.
Absolutely.
From these students who are coming from other parts of the world.
Again, when one is privileged, it's really important that you meet and know and learn from those who have not been so privileged, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And also, there are many Bard students who are in many ways not privileged. And then there's this assumption that they're going to this small, private, very beautiful liberal arts campus and that they must come from privileged backgrounds. So I also take care of a lot of students who are struggling with that, with this idea that they must be wealthy because they go to Bard. But actually, Bard students a few years ago started a food pantry because there are so many students at Bard with food insecurity. So it really is, I think it's so easy from the outside looking in to see a place or an institution as a monolith, but once you get within it, you realize that everyone is bringing their own experiences to it. And one thing that I really do love about BARD is that they give students space to implement projects like that, like the food pantry, where students will recognize what the problems are, where there's holes in the system of support, and build from there. And so, many of the most amazing programs at BARD and associated with BARD are thought of and initiated by students.
It's so exciting.
Yeah.
It must be so great to be surrounded by that kind of energy and vision on a regular basis.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah. I'm often asked by moms in my office how they might prepare their girls best for college. What would you say to that inquiry?
I mean, I think...
And we can talk about girls and boys,
yeah,
too,
yeah.
but they're just... Because I'm a gynecologist, they ask about their girls.
I'm sure. Yeah, I think that probably the best thing... And I also don't know. My daughter, like I mentioned, is about to be 4, so I am far from having these conversations with her. But I think that what I would hope to impart her with, or for parents to impart their children with, is paying attention to their bodies, a sense that they can have ownership over their bodies, that if something doesn't feel right, they should ask someone or talk to someone. Too often, I feel like we see patients weeks or months, or depending on what the issue is, days after when we wish they had come in, because there is this idea that you just live with what you've been dealt. And so I would hope that people are empowering their students to ask for help, because that is a big part of being out in the world and learning how to navigate the world, is to ask for help when you need it. And then I think just also emotionally giving them the tools to, if they're, whether it's physical or psychological, to recognize, really it just comes down to learning how to ask for help and to recognize when you need it.
It's also about discovering the language around our bodies. That so often I meet patients who, when I ask about a complaint, they stumble. They are paralyzed by the inability to give words to a pain or a symptom or a fear or whatever. And in my environment, so often my patients don't even know anatomy.
Yeah.
They don't have it's like always just down there or up here. And I spend moments where I'm like, okay, let's talk about down there. There's this anatomy. Are we talking about your vagina? Are we talking about your anus? Where are you experiencing this? So being in the body with knowledge and the absence of fear. For me, one of the most, amongst many concerns I have, is that when you open a magazine these days, every other page is an advertisement for a pharmaceutical.
Yeah.
And it's not just take this medicine if you have these symptoms, but then this laundry list of side effects, most of which are terrifying. And we have pathologized everything.
Yeah.
And I'm talking about both pathology, but I'm talking about also just the everyday aches and pains that I want our patients to be able to say, oh, I have a low backache. What is that? Rather than jumping to it's an STI or that it's cancer, whatever, because that's all they're seeing.
Yeah.
To be able to just evaluate and be able to talk about the normal, everyday challenges of being in the world in our body.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that it's interesting. One of the pieces of my practice that I most kind of see as a through line, whether in my prior work working with people of all ages or now specifically with college students, is that piece of really trying to figure out what it is that's bothering you, why it's bothering you, and whether there are things that you have any control over that can change it. Because I will say, and particularly in my prior work, but also now, especially working with students who are in the conservatory, so they're professional or pre-professional musicians, there are times when what you're asking your body to do is just hard. And there's what we can do to try and help you deal with how your body is now hurting, but also a lot of it is going back and learning the preventative pieces that will keep you safe and healthy while you put these demands on your body. And so, I believe very strongly in physical therapy, in conditioning, and in helping people learn how to use their bodies in ways that will help them continue doing what they enjoy doing for as long as they can. It's easier said than done.
For all of us, right?
Yeah.
It's a lifelong journey because we're talking about boundaries.
Yeah.
And without being silly, when we talk about college-age students, we're often talking about condoms, and that's the boundary we're talking about. But what you're speaking to, and I think is just so important for our audience, is to recognize, not just when we're college students, but throughout our lives, that we should be asking ourselves, asking our clinicians, asking our friends, what do you do to support wellness and health? And that things like stress, physical stress, emotional stress, the stressors of finals, my gosh, how does that impact the body and ways in which we can try to be as well as possible in the face of those stressors?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So oftentimes I find myself, I always, I want people to feel like they came to the doctor and got some answers, but I try to not always make it a situation where they feel like they have to leave with a medication. Because so often that's not actually the answer. And when it is, it's amazing. There are so many things when someone comes in with a target rash and I can give them doxycycline and treat their Lyme disease and keep them from having future complications, I find that a miracle of science. And that is more the exception than the rule, I would say, that a medication is the end-all be-all of the response.
No, I hope that all clinicians who are working with college-age students in particular are teaching these patients how to seek wellness in the absence of big pharma.
Yeah.
Because we are living again in a country that has become so dependent on big pharma. Again, the culture of pathologizing everything and that the quick fix is big pharma, I think is really a disaster in the making.
I agree. And I think it's not just big pharma. I completely agree. And I think there's a lot of money in just the everyday drugstores as well.
Absolutely.
And just the amount of repackaging of a cold medication that I see when I walk into CVS, and it's all the same medication, but it's called so many different things. And it's really a shame the ways in which I think it really is. It's a consumerism that has infiltrated everything in our society, but particularly the way that people think about their health.
Yeah, there's been such a huge movement in these huge companies owning healthcare.
Right.
And unfortunately, their mission, and this is my opinion, is about the dollar.
Right.
And that it's become a big business, a huge business, and that it's not really about the mission of helping people heal, be well, because there's no money in wellness, so to speak, and the interface of these companies with pharmacies, big pharma, the government.
Yeah.
The FDA is riddled with problems. They get a huge amount of money from big pharma.
Yeah.
So there's a huge amount of conflict of interest. And so if we can teach young people how to recognize wellness, ways of being well, illness, what that looks like, And I like to also speak about the range and the spectrum of that we're all a little ill and we're all a little well, and we're all moving between it like a wave. And that's the normal state of human beings.
Yeah, I appreciate that. One of my mentors in my training always talked about how important it was to help people. She worked with a lot of folks with chronic pain. And just the idea that to live well doesn't necessarily mean the absence of pain.
That's right.
We all have pain in our lives, and so that it's about managing it. It's about finding ways to be able to continue your life and to not let that, not to ignore the pain or minimize it, but to find ways to live through it.
Yeah. And again, for our audience, we're not just talking about young people. We're talking about everyone, all of us. A way of integrating our body and our mind into our everyday life, understanding there's tumult.
Yeah.
And that's normal. It just is. And there are days that one feels really well, and there are days where not so well. And that may be, again, a result of you're in finals, or your roommates all had the flu last week, and guess what? It's creeping into your system, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah,
absolutely.
I think that's a part of what I want to talk about now is this concept of empowering students and patients alike in the morass of the healthcare system. You've mentioned it, but I want you to speak more about that, if you would, please.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel very strongly that our healthcare system is broken. And maybe not that it's broken. I have spent a lot of time around folks who are prison abolitionists, and part of what they've taught me is that the prison system's not broken. It's working exactly as it's designed.
That's right. That's right.
And I feel that way about the healthcare system. It's working for the ends of, as you mentioned, corporations making money. Is it working at keeping all of us safer and healthier and living more healthy lives? I would say no. Because really, in my interactions with the healthcare system, both as a clinician and as a patient, because none of us are those of us who are clinicians are also always patients, it is mind-boggling to me how many pieces of it are designed almost in opposition to keeping us well and to keeping us healthy. I'm very forthcoming about that with my patients. I feel very lucky to have been trained in a setting where that was something that I was taught to bring to my practice, was a social justice lens, a critical lens of the system within which we're working. And so I try to help students advocate for themselves and patients, but my patients are students at every level, and also to find ways to engage with the system that work for them. I also think that there's really interrupting the concept of a patient as a consumer is at the heart of it. And that's one of the things that for me has been so freeing about working in college health. And I think for any of your listeners who may be clinicians themselves, they can understand how much charting, writing medical notes with the end of being reimbursed by insurance really drives the way that medicine is practiced in the US. And so being in this tiny bubble of college health, where that is not the case, where when we're writing medical notes, it's really just for the other providers and for ourselves and for the patient whose medical record it is. And I'm not trying to make it sound like something that the insurance company will then give our practice money for. It has been very liberating. Yeah,
there's so many things I want to comment on. I have heard myself say far too often, perhaps, is that I have been an exceptionally well-trained data collector. And what a shame.
Yeah.
Because I have other things to offer. And in the 15 minutes that I have to see a patient, I'm collecting data that is meaningless, quite frankly, to this person's well-being, but it's because I've been told I need to have this information on an electronic medical record.
Exactly.
So I'm so grateful that you do not have to deal with that. You're also touched on, though you didn't use the word, but I'm going to use the word hierarchy, that part of the patriarchy historically and even currently is that doctor is master, doctor is God, and that patients are below. And what I love about this age group that you work with is they blow that to smithereens most of the time. And I love that because, in fact, for me, and I suspect for you too, healing is an exchange. And that you're learning about them, they're learning about you or learning from you. And that's where productive wellness, health, and moving forward in one's body comes from. I guess I'd ask you, when you say that you want to teach these folks how to be advocates for themselves, what does that mean to you? What does advocacy mean?
Well, I think there's both being an advocate for yourself as an individual in the world. And so learning how to speak up for your needs, to ask for what you need and want and desire. And then I also think that I believe that none of us will get where we're trying to get to without the collective. And so I think it is crucial. I think I come from a world of engaging with and being part of organizing and activist work. And I see how that work can be incredibly stressful and draining, but also the deep meaning that being connected to a larger struggle gives people and has given me in my life through different phases in my life. And when I have students who are righteously angry about some part of the system with which they're interacting, I think it is a big part of their health and wellness to then try to work with other people to do something about it. One of the pieces that we haven't really gotten into, one of the things I love about my job is that I get to interact with students not just as patients, but I've gotten to work with students who are running different clubs on campus, who are peer health educators, who are starting new programs. And that is incredibly inspiring because they're both dealing with their own selves, but also really trying to make a difference for the young people around them as well.
That must be so exciting.
Yeah.
And again, what an opportunity to learn for yourself. Yeah. We're speaking about the universality of the body, health, ill health, and everyone's pursuit in feeling good, right? And it means different things to different people. But there is this wonderful gold thread that ties us all together, which is that we hopefully want to live our lives fully and engaged and learning, accepting when we can accept, and be angry when we need to be angry. And this concept of community. For me, college was one of the best experiences I ever had in being in community. And so to live amidst that and engage with that on a regular basis is a gift that I'm so glad that you have.
Yeah, me too. I went to a very different college as an undergraduate. I was in the middle of New York City. I have close friends from my undergraduate years, but that was not a place where I felt like I had a lot of community in many ways. Although the places when I was in college where I found community were the student activist groups that I was a part of. And the major that I was a part of, I was a Latina studies major. And that was part of taking those classes was learning to fight the institution because the college I went to was not particularly supportive of that field of study. So when I think that's part of what I identify with when I see these young people like channeling their righteous anger into building community, into trying to fight together for change. That was very much where I found my community in college. And yeah, it's really it really feels like an honor to get to see them and to see what they're doing, where they're pushing things now, which is beyond what I could have imagined.
Yeah, yeah. So I would imagine, but please correct me if I'm wrong, that there is a gathering of directors of health services on colleges, that conventions, if you will. That's what
Yes.
we'd call them in medicine. Are you, Bard is a bastion of liberal thought and a place that has been directed by a president who is a visionary. But not all colleges are of that ilk. So I'm wondering, when you meet your peers, your professional peers, how has that been? Are you seeing that there's been an evolution on most college campuses that are in the right direction, or is there a great deal of conflict when you meet people? And I'm going to be very judgmental here or generalizing. People who are working in the South or who are not in the Northeast.
Yeah. I just started in college health a year ago. And I went to there is a big national meeting, the American College Health Association, which I was lucky enough to go to this past spring, beginning of summer. And I will say that in general, the folks who are working in college health are really supportive of young people, are trying to do right by young people. And I feel very lucky to be practicing in a place where my entire job is not just fighting roadblocks from the government, from the larger institution of the school. I think a lot of people have to spend a lot of their energy fighting to take care of their students in the ways that they know are right. So this past summer, I had the privilege of helping the process of rewriting the ACHA, which is the American College Health Association's guidelines on sexual health. So I was working with people from across the country who are sexual health educators, who are clinicians, and there are certainly people who are working in states, in universities, where that work is completely demonized. But those people are doing such important work because they're reaching students who are hearing messages that are so detrimental in every direction. And they're finding ways to connect with students, to support students in those settings. And so I've been really inspired actually by many of the people I got to meet, both at the national meetings, but also through this working group, this kind of working group who are still doing the work in places where they're criminalizing gender-affirming care, where they've completely criminalized abortion care. But I find that the practitioners that I've interacted with are very much aligned.
It's your story is a great teacher, that we might be privileged to live in a community where independent thought, choice around our bodies is well established, both in law and in the social norms. But even here in New York State, there are many places where women have to travel hundreds of miles to get an abortion.
Absolutely.
Where access to care in the middle of the Bronx is still extremely limited. And that these folks who are working under such dire, difficult, challenging communities, both legal parameters and social parameters, are finding ways in which to help young people be well and know their options is just so inspiring and important for us to, in any way we can, support those individuals.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think a big piece of it, just to bring it back to the patriarchy, is also, when I say empowering people around their bodies, I really mean it. So I think there's so much that we hold tightly within medicine that I think comes from this protective professionalization of the field that has historical roots. And I think we have to think in these moments when there really is, on some level, a drive towards fascism in this country, we have to be creative. We have to think outside the structures and the parameters that we've been given to the ways that we can help people take care of themselves in and around and despite those structures.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So I want to remind our audience, that I'm speaking to Dr. Yakira Teitel, the Director of Health Services at Bard College in Annondale-on-Hudson. So there's so much that I'm sure our audience wants to know, and one of which is, I think we have to touch on sex.
Mm-hmm.
And that sex is something I love to talk about. One, because I want it to be out there. I want it to be as normalized as talking about the menu at a restaurant we went to last night. I think part of the patriarchy is the suppression of certainly the pleasures that women should have when they have sex. But college is often the place where so many young folks are beginning to explore their sexual experiences. What do you want to say about that?
That is very true. There are also many college students who are not having sex. I think there is a perception that college students, that's all they do is use drugs and have sex.
Yeah.
And there is a lot of that. And I love getting to talk to young people about it. I love getting to help people. I've certainly had some particularly young women who are just for the first time figuring out that they are allowed to prioritize their pleasure. And that they cannot have sex if it doesn't feel good, or not with that person, or not in that way. I've learned a ton about sex just from the students at Bard who are, that is one of the pieces of the world where I feel like they're really far ahead, where there's some really amazing sex positive work being led by students at Bard. And there is something called the Dime Store, which is a student-led organization where students can order safer sex supplies anonymously. They get delivered anonymously to their P.O. boxes.
Fantastic.
And it's free. And that kind of project is amazing when I think about just how freeing that is, because I've had students who were like, I never would have thought about trying lube or trying flavored lube or even experimenting with using a dental dam. All these things that I think there's so much, they're so hidden, right? And so to have students running an organization that says, they're very out there, just being positive about it, having people experiment, having people try things is really amazing to see and very inspiring.
And sharing this with each other. That's what's so great is there's I love the metaphor of this huge bulletin board, right?
Yeah.
And it's not just about job opportunity, but, have you tried this dildo today?
Yeah.
Because that's what's going to empower these young folks in the bedroom, on the college campuses, and then beyond.
Mm-hmm.
Because so much of, again, the lessons we learn at that age are formative and will move through our lives and continue to expand and contract and process, right?
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. Great. And I'm so glad you mentioned that there are students who are not having sex.
Yeah.
There is this prejudice about sex, drugs, and rock and roll that is it's partially true, but it doesn't define everyone. And moreover, I think if you can have sex, drug, and rock and roll in a place where you have access to a great medical director and to a great counseling center, and where you can mess up and learn about your body, your sexuality, all of the things we've been talking about this morning. What a gift.
Yeah. To have a safe space to be doing that in is everything. Absolutely.
Yeah. Great. So, Yakira, I've been asking my patients at the end of our visits by answering a question about pleasure. And you've mentioned pleasure this morning. In all my years, I have rarely asked myself what gives me pleasure. I have experienced it, but yet rarely taken the time to genuinely ask myself, what makes me happy? What gives me joy? I don't think I'm alone. My experience with most women is that they spend their days giving to their families, their communities, working through hardships, and multitasking their way through their days. So I've decided that Gyno Curious is going to give each of us a moment and the opportunity to answer the question, what gives you pleasure? With the hope that taking the time to think about it might help you realize the pleasures more regularly and to seek them out. So Yakira, what gives you pleasure and joy in your life?
So many things actually bring me pleasure. And when I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation about moving out here, that was really about trying to reconnect with the things that bring me pleasure. Because I felt very much that even though I was doing work that felt important, I wasn't getting a lot of space to do the things that bring me joy, that bring me pleasure. And for me, a lot of that is interacting with the world in a creative way. I'm a painter. I've been doing more ceramics recently, but making art is, for me, it's a meditative practice. It's a therapeutic practice, and it's just pleasurable and brings me joy. It can be torturing as well. Absolutely.
Well, there's a part of that to every pleasure, right?
It's true, yeah. But yeah, the creative process brings me the deepest pleasure. And honestly, getting to share that with my daughter, watching her be creative and experiencing the world in this imaginative space is amazing to me. Spending time with my loved ones. For me, my friendships are incredibly important, and my family as well. But friendship is really like at the core of what's gotten me through this life, that connecting with people that you're choosing to connect with in the deepest ways over and over again. That's what saves me. So deep conversations with my friends, like laughing so hard it hurts with my friends, just like hugs bring me deep pleasure if they're with people that I want to be hugging in ways that I want to be hugging them. And yeah, the one thing about living in the Hudson Valley is the natural beauty we're surrounded by every day. Just this morning, walking with my little dog and my daughter, and the flowers that are blooming everywhere, the crickets that are just full on in their summer life, just having that time and space to appreciate the beauty of the planet that we live on brings me a lot of pleasure.
May you have many, many days of all those things.
Thank you.
Yakira, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
To our listeners, please join me each episode. And if you like what you hear, just subscribe and follow us on whatever podcast app you're listening on. I would love to hear from you. Please email your questions and comments to comments@radiofreerhiniecliff.org or call us at 845-307-7446. Thank you also to my producers, Jen Hammoud and Matty Rosenberg. Until our next conversation, stay healthy and stand strong in your knowledge and your insights.